Next moment, the luggage, the seat, the platform, and the station had completely vanished. The four children, holding hands and panting, found themselves standing in a woody place, such a woody place that branches were sticking into them, and there was hardly any room to move. They all rubbed their eyes and took a deep breath. "Oh, Peter!" exclaimed Lucy. "Do you think we can possibly have got back to Narnia?" "It might be anywhere," said Peter. "I can't see a yard in all these trees. Let's try to get into the open, if there is any open." With some difficulty and with some stings from nettles and pricks from thorns, they struggled out of the thicket. Then they had another surprise. Everything became much brighter, and after a few steps they found themselves at the edge of the wood, looking down on a sandy beach. A few yards away, a very calm sea was falling on the sand with such tiny ripples that it made hardly any sound. There was no land in sight, and no clouds in the sky. The sun was about where it ought to be at 10 o'clock in the morning, and the sea was dazzling blue. They stood sniffing the sea smell. "By Jove," said Peter, "this is good enough." 5 minutes later, everyone was barefooted and wading in the cool, clear water.
I was pointing out last time that the Christian life is simply a process of having your natural self changed into a Christ self.
Welcome back to the Inklings Variety Hour. I am Chris Pipkin, and we have a new guest co-host with us this week. This is Mr. Logan Huggins.
Thanks for having me on. I'm so excited to dive into Prince Caspian, and been a big fan of the show for a long time.
Logan reached out to us, said he'd like to come on the show, and we were excited to have him. He also, by the way, if you've noticed an uptick in the audio quality, that's his doing, and we are so grateful for that. And I am so grateful for that because that's usually me that has to do that, and it takes forever. So thank you.
No, of course. And again, I feel like I'm in a very safe position because if this podcast turns out great, wonderful, we'll have two people talking about Prince Caspian. But if not, I'll just edit all my stuff out and you'll just be sitting here talking about Prince Caspian by yourself.
There you go.
There you go. We'll see how it goes.
Have you, by the way, ever seen Garfield without Garfield?
No, I haven't.
So there's a website called Garfield Without Garfield that has Garfield and Odie edited out, so it's just like the existential.
Just John.
John Arbuckle talking to himself. It's wonderful.
That makes sense. Knowing what I know about what the internet has done to Garfield over the past several years, that
doesn't surprise
me in the least.
Yeah. That's a tangent for another time, I guess. Logan, stop me if you've heard this one. A young orphan with a special destiny is raised and mistreated by his uncle and aunt, both of whom favor their own son over him and hate the fantastic. In secret, the boy develops a penchant for magic and is inducted by his teachers into a strange new world full of strange creatures and otherworldly portals on train platforms. I'm talking, of course, about C.S. Lewis's second Narnian book, Prince Caspian.
For a little bit there, I thought you were going into Star Wars, but when you said train station, I was like, no, I see where you're going here.
And I was trying to mislead people into thinking that I was talking about
Harry Potter, of course.
Harry Potter.
Well, that's one of those great narrative devices to kick off a story, kill the parents, and leave an orphan with their aunts and uncle who mistreat them.
Yep.
There's a wide list of narrative stories that probably start off that way. So we're in good company.
Yeah, I think so. When did you first read Prince Caspian? What were kind of your first impressions of the book?
Totally. Well, I have to admit something. I am one of those weirdos and unfortunate souls that actually saw the movie first back in 2008.
From C.S. Lewis's epic masterpiece,
the fate of Narnia depends on you.
This Christmas,
I had seen the first movie, The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, and I was like, okay, that's cool. I see where they're going here. I remember watching the second one, Prince Caspian, and I remember being so bored with it because so much of it was that typical sort of Hollywood grossness that sort of Hollywood puts on all of its movie adaptations.
Who are you?
I am Prince Caspian.
All that you know is about to change.
It was
And,
not a great movie.
It was not a great movie, but unfortunately, that was my first exposure to it. And I remember years later when I got a hold of the actual books and started going through the books, I remember sort of dreading it, thinking like, "Oh, this is the one where they have that weird rivalry between Peter and Caspian, and there's this weird like romance between Susan and Caspian." I remember as I got through the book, I was like so pleasantly surprised none of that's in the book. That's all sort of that Hollywood glaze that they have to put on everything to sort of movify it.
Yeah.
And so I was so pleasantly surprised that the book is nothing like the movie, and it's very un-Hollywood. And I'm sure we'll talk about it in this episode. It's a very weird story. It's a very odd sort of follow-up to Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. In a way, I can see why the directors or the producers, whoever tried to jazz it up, because it is such an odd sort of format for a story. And I'm sure we'll get into it. But yeah, I was pleasantly surprised when I actually read the book for the first time, thinking this is not Hollywood at all, but it's still very much C.S. Lewis.
Yeah, it is an awkward adolescent sequel. And I say that not that it's not like necessarily for adolescents, but just as in the movie, there were a few awkward adolescents who were, exploring their weird feelings for each other. So in the book, it's sort of the process of Lewis making what was a single book into kind of a series and sort of trying to explore this world and create this world and figure out what it's even about. It's a strange book for sure. I really like it though. And the more I think about it, of course, the more I like it.
Yeah, same. I think you're totally right on. And I think it's interesting to see just the structure of it, the story of Prince Caspian. It's such an odd start because the children get pulled into Narnia. We're like, okay, that's sort of usual. They come back into Narnia. They have a little bit of an adventure. And then we sort of have to tell a story inside the story of this is who Prince Caspian is. This is who the Telmarines are. This is who this is. That's great. And it's an interesting, intriguing story. And obviously C.S. Lewis is such a gifted, talented writer. He makes that story interesting and worthwhile listening to. But man, I realized the book's like 14, 15 chapters long, and the action doesn't start until like chapter 10 or 11. It's so much build up and reframing and let me catch you up to what happened over the past 1500 years or whatever. It's such an odd structure of a story.
Yeah, I noticed that with Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe too. Even though it works a little bit better in some ways, there's tons and tons of build up and philosophical sort of ramblings about other worlds and Edmund being a jerk and build up. And then finally the action at the end happens in like one chapter.
Right. I reread Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe in preparation for this podcast. And I remember thinking like, wait, we didn't even see the battle. When the battle's happening, we're following Aslan doing what he does. And then we sort of rejoin the battle at the very end when Aslan comes in and saves the day. I just remember thinking, wait, I thought there was this great big awesome battle scene. What I was remembering was Prince Caspian. But it's I'm sure it's obviously intentional by C.S. Lewis.
Yeah. Definitely speaks to, and I think part of your being pleasantly surprised that the book was not like the Prince Caspian movie, it speaks to the kind of disjunction between sort of Hollywood values and what Hollywood thinks makes a good story. Lots of big battle scenes with lots of CGI, and romance and conflict, and then what Lewis decides to do, right, which is just a different sort of thing.
Yeah, and I'm sure you in your classes have talked to your students about narratives and how stories are told. You have to be sort of a grand storyteller like C.S. Lewis to write a story where the first 10 chapters are sort of set up. Out of a 15 chapter book, the first 2/3 of it are set up, and we're just stumbling along. We're having, there's stuff happening and there's important things happening. Any lesser author was sort of given to the temptation to have an inciting incident and be like, all right, we need to have a battle up here and then maybe like a chase scene through here. But C.S. Lewis, as wise as he is and how intentionally, there's a reason why he does that, I think, which is what we're going to get into.
Just seeing my son start reading, there are so many newer books that have realized they really have to compete with a lot of other forms of entertainment. And so they're going to try to hook you right from the beginning. You can afford to be slower in older books because there's not much else that you're really competing with, right? And so children's literature, up until the time that Lewis was writing and even after, it could just afford to go at a slower pace. What are the children going to do? They're going to watch TV? No. They could go play outside, right? Or play sports or something like that, right? If they don't have joints in their thumbs like Lewis couldn't play sports. So you can just afford to get a lot more philosophical and meandering and just kind of sometimes weird.
Yeah, and it's that slow burn, like you mentioned, a lot of that's lost on the modern media because, like you said, any movie or video game or story that's being told now, it's like bang right out of the gate, and it's trying to hook you. But there's sort of that lost art that we see in Tolkien and we see in Lewis and so many of these older artists of that slow burn of the story building over time. And it's great that we all want those payoffs at the end of our stories. We want that conclusion. We want that sort of catharsis. But like in a story like Caspian, where it builds up literally so long, to me at least, to such a fulfilling ending because of that, not in spite of it.
Absolutely.
I wanted to get your perspective on this. I sort of had this weird revelation. There's a weird sort of connection to the biblical books in the New Testament. Stick with me if this is too far of a stretch. But if The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is equal to the Gospels, in the sense of narratively laying out the main characters, Aslan hits the scene, victory is won, Aslan creates kings and queens. The main thrust of what the whole Narnian story is about is sort of boiled down into that first book of Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe. If Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe is the Gospels, then I would like to theorize that Prince Caspian equates the book of Acts, or maybe even the whole New Testament. The reason where I came to that conclusion was when I went through Prince Caspian a time or two, I just remember seeing this huge picture of community. Like this, the C.S. Lewis is constantly giving us all these different examples and pictures of a diverse, huge body of people and characters all working together under the head of Aslan, under the mission of Aslan, but they're making decisions and they're trying to lead and they're graciously trying to give advice. There's so much talking in this book and there's so many characters in this book. The list of characters from Lion, the Witch, Wardrobe, pretty long, but the list of named characters in Caspian is probably twice as long. There's a ton of characters, and it's so cool that C.S. Lewis gives them all something to do. All these characters playing all these different roles, and they really are sort of forming that whole classic sort of biblical idea of many parts in one body. Sort of that thing that you see throughout the book of Acts and throughout the whole New Testament. So I know we'll get into it. I don't want to dive too deep into it right off the bat, but I just was super excited to realize, I was like, oh my gosh, there's this weird sort of biblical connection. Like if the Lion, the Witch, Wardrobe sets it up like the gospel does, then Prince Caspian is sort of a mix of like, okay, Aslan sort of won the victory. Now let's see the body work together and accomplish or attempt to accomplish the mission of Aslan as sort of this big, messy body of person.
Yeah, I like that a lot. That's really interesting, and there are interesting parallels to the Book of Acts.
Well, if the last battle is Revelation, which it pretty much is,
yeah,
the last battle will be Revelation, and then was that 5 books? They're probably a continuation of that idea, a body working together, and Edmund and Lucy and the Dawn Treader and the Silver Chair and all those other. I'm sure they fit in there somewhere too. But as for our discussion on Prince Caspian, I thought, oh, this might be fun to.
Yeah. No, I like that a lot, and I like especially how you're emphasizing the very diverse crowd all working together, right? Like you've got mice and giants and dwarves.
You got dwarves, you got red dwarves, you got black dwarves, you got half dwarves, you got, like you said, giants and centaurs and all these tree spirits and river spirits. Oh my gosh, it's a party, and it's like such a crazy big. I think it's Nick, and that's the thing. They don't get it right off the front. They make decisions, they lose the battle. Like they have hiccups along the way, and they still sort of have grace with each other and there's a huge theme of honor in this book, of giving honor to one another and encouraging one another and giving counsel, and I'm sorry that didn't work out, please forgive me, like that kind of stuff over and over and over again. Like this book is just a huge knot of examples of giving grace to one another, which is really cool.
I like that a lot. I know that Lewis finished it before The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe was published.
Well, I think I do think there's something interesting we could probably pull out of that. They always say the hardest thing is not making a hit record, it's making a second hit record.
Yep.
That sort of idea of like, oh shoot, the first book was a huge success, how do I follow it up? And it's neat to know that C.S. Lewis was already working on sequels and follow-up books before the first book was even out. It just shows how intentional he meant to build it that way. He didn't have that pressure of following up The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe because it wasn't even out yet.
I did read something interesting about the odd part at the very end, but and how that may have been a response to one of Tolkien's complaints about The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, but we'll get to that.
Oh, really? Interested in that, yeah.
Most of the currently published editions of the Narnia books, either as like a whole big tome or as separate books, place Prince Caspian fourth It causes no end of confusion for like people like my son when I'm like, no, don't read it that way. Read the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe first.
It's nice to know that even in the Chronicles of Narnia fandom, there's a Greedo shot first, Han shot first type controversy, and it's the order of the book.
Yeah, most scholars that I've heard, of course, it might just be that this is what they grew up with, but most scholars that I've heard are pretty emphatic about you need to read it second. It was written second, and I'm very much in this camp as well. The reason why Lewis is still very much figuring out what Narnia is like, and you're going to be annoyed by the sort of, like I said before, adolescent quality of this book. And by adolescent, I just mean like everything is still maturing. If you've read some of his more mature Narnia works already, like The Magician's Nephew and The Horse and His Boy, Lewis has figured out exactly what Narnia is by that point. In Prince Caspian and Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe, he had not quite yet. They're still really interesting books, but it's going to be distracting if, there's one rule for talking beasts and non-talking beasts in The Magician's Nephew, and then another rule about how beasts become talking or not in Prince Caspian.
You're totally right. And yeah, I agree with you. It dovetails very nicely right after The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, because even the narrator, who I forget how present the narrator is in these stories. Like this isn't a book that you're reading and you feel like, oh, I'm reading a book. When you read this book, you really do feel like you're listening to someone tell you the story. Like Lewis is a very present narrator in all these books. It's just funny, these little asides he throws in there of like, you can read about it in the last book, or it's very sort of casual and off the cuff, which makes it so much fun to read, I think. I think even that sort of points to the whole theory of like, okay, this is the second book and you should read it following The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe.
He's not going to reference things that happened in The Magician's Nephew or in The Horse and His Boy, because they haven't yet. So
I'm glad we solved that, and any scholars can write into the Inklings Variety Hour at gmail.com. Send your complaints to Chris. He will be happy to answer all of your.
That's right. Let's talk about the frame narrative of this story. And by frame narrative, I just mean the part that gets narrated before there's another story that's told to the character. It's the end of a holidays. The Pevensies, who are Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy, formerly 4 kings and queens of Narnia, now children coming back from a holiday, and they're waiting at a train station. They get sucked suddenly into Narnia. Apparently, it hurts because they're all kind of like, ow! They don't know that it's Narnia yet, however. Instead, it seems to be the seashore, and they proceed exactly as children would in an adventure novel about being marooned on an island. Finally, just as they're getting concerned about going hungry, they find an overgrown orchard next to a wall and lean up against it. In the next chapter, the children realize that the orchard and walls are the ruins of Cair Paravel, from which they used to rule Narnia. And they've been gone for 1,300 years or so. They find their old treasures, Peter's sword, Lucy's cordial, and Susan's bow, but not her horn, which has the quality of being able to summon help whenever it's blown. Edmund didn't get a treasure. And
you can read about it in the last book.
But he does at least have an electric torch, at least till the end of this book. The children end up rescuing a red-bearded dwarf who's being drowned by 2 men in a boat. They shoot the men, but don't kill them. The dwarf talks to them a bit, telling them that he serves Caspian, and they're all like, who's Caspian? And so he proceeds with his story about Caspian.
And the real story begins. 3 chapters in, we hear our main character, which is such an odd choice. I imagine he did that on purpose, because if you were a fan of Narnia and you enjoyed the first book and you bought the second book, you open it up and you have to just jump right in with, here's Prince Caspian and here's Dr. and you're like, where's the children at? What happened to that last book? So here's your main characters from last book. They're back in Narnia, and then here's the story I want to tell, I assume. Would you agree with that?
I think so. I think that's a explanation for it. I think at least part of what seems to be going on, if I could be really metafictional here, is that Lewis is sort of figuring out how to write a sequel about a book that maybe he envisioned as sort of a one-off book before. So he knows he has to have the same characters, and he probably has the idea of Caspian in mind, but these characters are just sort of wandering around, almost waiting for something to happen. There's this Narnia of the past that they're kind of trying to reckon with and get back to, right? But it's also been a really long time. If you've ever tried to write fiction, if you try to put your mind back in the place where it was when you were beginning a story and you try to finish up the story sort of somewhere else, maybe months later or whatever else, it takes a lot of doing, and a lot of times it's impossible or very hard to sort of recreate the same setting correctly in your mind. So I wonder if this isn't Lewis reckoning with this a bit, the fact that he's trying to write a sequel to this book that he knows is good, even though it hasn't been published yet. As his mind wanders about trying to figure out ways in, the children are also sort of like wandering about trying to find ways in. That might be a bit too much, but it's just interesting that this is a sequel based on Narnia, but it's about trying to get back to old Narnia. And
Yeah.
Caspian too is trying to get back to old Narnia as well in his own way.
Yeah, it's definitely that idea of like Caspian's sort of goal is not to set up a new Narnia, but sort of restore that idea of previous Narnia, sort of like make things back the way they were.
Another thing that's really bizarre about these first 3 chapters is Lewis kind of imagining what it would be like to have been grown up already.
Mm-hmm.
So they keep thinking back to, oh yeah, remember back when we were adults, and we were kings and queens here, even though now we're children again. He doesn't get too distracted by this idea, but it's really odd. It's really interesting how the children are sort of, they're stepping back into this place where they were old, but they're not old anymore.
That's a really good point, and I think it's interesting because it reminds me of those. I think there's a few moments sprinkled through, and it might be Lion the Witch Wardrobe, it might be this book, I forget, but there's almost these moments of when they're in Narnia, they forget about England. Like I think Edmund or someone's like, back from that other place we used to live. What was it called? Oh yeah, England. It's almost as if they have to sort of reacclimate themselves to Narnia, and it sort of the more they're in Narnia, the less they think about the old world, and once they're in the real world, they sort of slowly forget about Narnia. It's such a they don't just jump back in and out so quickly. That probably like the way the movie showed it, but you sort of always hear those effects of the air of Narnia changes them, or it made them more valiant or more kingly or whatever.
Yeah, like the land that you step into, it's not just you changing it, but it changes you, right?
Absolutely, that's for sure.
And it's kind of a reverse Neverland effect in that, like in Neverland, like you do forget who you were, but you stay young all the time. But in Narnia, like you can apparently just grow up in Narnia, but yeah, you also forget there, right?
Yeah.
When they had drunk from the well and splashed their faces, they all went down the stream again to the shore and stared at the channel which divided them from the mainland. "We'll have to swim," said Edmund. "It would be all right for Sue," said Peter. Susan had won prizes for swimming at school. "But I don't know about the rest of us." By the rest of us, he really meant Edmund, who couldn't yet do 2 lengths at the school baths, and Lucy, who could hardly swim at all. "Anyway," said Susan, "there may be currents. Father says it's never wise to bathe in a place you don't know." "But Peter," said Lucy, "look here. I know I can't swim for nuts at home, in England, I mean. But couldn't we all swim long ago, if it was long ago, when we were kings and queens in Narnia? We could ride then, too, and do all sorts of things, don't you think?" "Ah, but we were sort of grown up then," said Peter. "We reigned for years and years and learned to do things. Aren't we just back at our proper ages again now?" This is, again, them kind of coming to grips with the fact that they are young again, and they used to be old, and they used to be able to do all these things, and like, of course, as time goes by in Narnia, they slowly learn to do those things again, and it comes back to them. And I wonder if they're somehow also like growing up faster, right? Or if they just kind of stay the same age, but they get those old abilities, or what exactly?
I almost like it that they're still in their children's bodies. They're still coming back as their proper ages, but their identity is still the kings and queens of Narnia. Like that's the title that they have. That's the sort of honor that they have, and that's still the position Aslan gave them. And I wonder if you can sort of like even connect that to that Christian ideal of we are sons and daughters of God, and we are heirs in the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God has come. We have all those sort of rights and privileges of that, but definitely put them in the bounds of their preteen, teenager body still. And I think that's an interesting dynamic there.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that a lot. Yeah, that's very sort of similar to, the disciples having experiences like various miracles and things like that, but then, not see the
Still,
new heavens and the new earth brought down,
right.
ultimately, right? Even if they see it in visions and things like that.
Yeah, it's just an interesting dynamic, and I think C.S. Lewis sort of dropped seeds of that throughout the whole book. Like again, that you get this whole idea of like, yeah, they are royalty, even though they look like they're like 11 years old. They're 12, however old Edmund and Lucy are. And also, how different would this story be if they came back as adults?
Yeah, I was thinking about that too.
That would take away so much of the story of like how
Yeah.
they're leading and how they're interacting with one another. Like, yeah, it adds so much flavor to the story because they come back as teenagers.
Yeah. I wonder if Lewis thought at all about doing that and about just having them be grown-ups as soon as they got there, or if he just kind of ruled that out from the outset, like, no, that's a non-starter, that would be a bad idea. It's also probably good that they weren't talking the way that they were talking by the time they left Narnia, right? Sounding like characters from Mallory.
Let us alight from our horses. Yes,
Mhm.
let us alight from our horses. I agree. Let us alight from our horses.
Yeah,
I'm like,
yeah.
get off your horses, gracious.
Yeah. He's imitating the style of Mallory, who is a little bit more eloquent than he needed to be in places, and also a little more repetitive. But Lewis loved playing around with that sort of style of, right. He would write letters to other people in that style, and they would write back to him in the same style. It was like a game. So yeah, he and you get just a little bit of it later on in this book. So the dwarf that they befriend and save tells the story of this Caspian, right? And interestingly, like, considering that this is about someone finding out that fairy tales are true, this beginning reads a little bit like a fairy tale. Yeah, he's raised by his rather unlikable uncle, Miraz. He's enchanted from the nursery by stories his nurse tells him about the good old days in Narnia before all the humans moved in, when there were such things as talking beasts, fauns, dryads, and competent human rulers. Miraz flies into a rage and fires Caspian's nurse, hiring in her place a tutor named Dr. Cornelius, who can teach Caspian sensible, practical lessons in how to be a ruler. But Dr. Cornelius, it turns out, is part dwarf, and he also tells Caspian that not only are the nurse's tales true, but he himself should do something to restore Narnia as it was. One night, Dr. Cornelius wakes Caspian up and tells him he must flee because the queen, who is named Pruna Prismia, has just had a son, and Miraz, who has killed Caspian's father, will probably now want to kill Caspian. So Caspian rides off in the dead of night. He's knocked unconscious by a tree branch, wakes up in a den of two dwarves, Trumpkin, a nice but skeptical dwarf, and Nikabrik, who's just not a nice dwarf at all, and also a badger named Trufflehunter. After deciding not to kill him, even after they find out he's the rightful king of Narnia, they take him around to raise an army against Miraz, full of animals and mythical people like fauns, dwarves, centaurs, etc. Eventually, Caspian's old tutor, Cornelius, joins them, but he tells them that the Telmarine army are coming to crush the rebellion already. They hole up at Aslan's Howe, former stone table site, and after a few battles go very badly for them, they decide to use Susan's horn, which has the virtue that anyone who blows it will receive help. Cornelius, who has brought them the horn, figures that help will either come from the Lantern Waste, where the four children originally came, or Cair Paravel, or over the sea. So Trumpkin is sent to Cair Paravel, where he's captured and almost killed by Miraz's men. Finally, that whole frame story ends. The children are excited to come help Caspian, but Trumpkin doesn't believe they're really the old kings and queens because he's a bit of an anti-supernaturalist, although he's a good sort. So they have to prove themselves through a series of competitions. Trumpkin is impressed and beaten by Edmund's swordplay and Susan's shooting, but it isn't until Lucy uses her cordial to heal him that he believes in them, though he doesn't believe in Aslan yet. Then the five of them row off toward the mainland. Yeah, did I leave anything out of that summary that you feel like was really important?
Yeah, we spent a lot of time talking already about what an interesting start to a story it is. But fortunately, C.S. Lewis is an enchanting writer and even makes characters telling a story who are also telling a story, he still makes it interesting and fun to read and fun to listen to. So yeah.
Yeah, kind of at the end of Chapter 3. So the dwarf settled down and told his tale. I shall not give it to you in his words, putting in all the children's questions and interruptions, because it would take too long and be confusing, and even so, it would leave out some points that the children only heard later. But the gist of the story, as they knew it in the end, was as follows. Like you were saying, I think it's probably likely that this is the part that he thought of first and wrote first, right?
No, I think it's likely. You want to write a follow-up to Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe, and all these readers are expecting, oh great, where did Lucy and Edmund and Susan and Peter end up? And then if they were to start reading the book and like, who's Prince Caspian? Who's this? Like, where's my favorite characters? So I think he mercifully gives us a familiar faces at first, and then gets into the story he really wants to tell.
Yeah. So we get this Narnia that 1,000 plus minus years after stuff in Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe is resolved, has another problem. And that problem is that Miraz has suppressed, actually all the Telmarines, even before Miraz, have suppressed all the sort of magical folk, whether it's the talking beasts or fauns and satyrs and dryads and dwarves and whatnot. So just as the White Queen had, caused it to be always winter and never Christmas, and had sort of a police state going on. Same sort of thing is happening again, except this time there's no magic at all. There's no White Witch. It's just
nothing. Yeah, exactly. Nothing but cold, hard men that are like just living their naturalistic life. There's no such thing as magic. There's no such thing as lions.
What do you make of that? And is Miraz worse than the White Witch? Is he better than the White Witch?
Part of me thinks he's not as evil as the White Witch, because he's not completely directly antagonistic to Aslan.
Yeah.
He just wants to put himself, let history erase, and let's forget about the old time. Just forget about that and move on. Whereas the White Witch was actively secret police sort of hunting down Aslan supporters. If you were to ask me which one of those is worse, I don't know. They're both pretty terrible. They both are very unfriendly to Aslan and his compatriots. What do you think?
It's interesting because the White Witch ruled by magic. You always get a sense that Lewis is, even though he's not trying to write allegory, he's got these little pointed satirical moments, right, where he'll like seem to be saying something about our world. So with the White Witch, she has a secret police, and it's all very behind the Iron Curtain sort of thing. But at the same time, she is a sorceress. With Miraz, yeah, it's a kind of suppression.
It's a much more subtle suppression. Yeah. It's a much more, let's get rid of the old stories and forget all that. And suppression through education and suppression through curriculum control, if that is such a thing, of like, all right, we're going to teach this new way. This is what the history of Narnia, and wipes away all that the children did and all that Aslan has done through a subtler way than the White Witch did. Yeah,
that's a great point. And he has so much to say about education in this book. And education plays a huge role. And Caspian, luckily, is educated well, unlike the hero of the next story that we'll read. But Caspian first has a nurse who tells him the right kind of stories, right? Tells him these, in Narnia, they're not just fairy tales. They're like the true history of Narnia.
Reality, right? of Narnia, yeah.
And then he gets a tutor. Notice he doesn't go to school. Lewis was not big on school, but he gets a tutor, and tutors are pretty great. And the tutor ends up being someone who confirms all this stuff. Not only sort of gives Caspian practical ins and outs of his future job as king, supposedly, but also, educates him about old Narnia. So I love this moment when Caspian tries to ask Cornelius. No men, or very few, lived in Narnia before the Telmarines took it, said Dr. Cornelius. Then who did my great-great-grandsisters conquer? Whom, not who, your highness, said Dr. Cornelius. Perhaps it is time to turn from history to grammar. Oh, please, not yet, said Caspian. I mean, wasn't there a battle? Why is he called Caspian the Conqueror if there was nobody to fight with him? I said there are very few men in Narnia, said the doctor, looking at the little boy very strangely through his great spectacles. For a moment, Caspian was puzzled, and then suddenly his heart gave a leap. Do you mean, he gasped, that there were other things? Do you mean it was like in the stories? Were there... Hush, said Dr. Cornelius, laying his head very close to Caspian's. Not a word more. Don't you know your nurse was sent away for telling you about old Narnia? The king doesn't like it. If he found me telling you secrets, you'd be whipped and I should have my head cut off. But why? Asked Caspian. It is high time we turned to grammar now, said Dr. Cornelius in a loud voice. Will your royal highness be pleased to open Pulverulentus Siccus at the 4th page of his grammatical garden or the arbor of accidents, pleasantly open to tender wits? After that it was all nouns and verbs till lunchtime. He's getting these little seeds of things he's actually interested in, but it's within this larger context of him having to learn, grammar.
Dr. Cornelius is streetwise enough to know, I really want to tell this kid about who Aslan is, but I have to keep my cover. I love that when he does come out and tell Caspian, it's like in the tallest tower, apparently 7 rooms between here and the nearest hallway, and there's each room is locked, and there's like 2 stairways. So like Dr. Cornelius is a very wise teacher in the sense of like, I want to tell you, but we got to do this on the down low.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing about this chapter is the supposed reason that he has for taking Caspian up there on the tower is that there's a conjunction, right, of 2 stars. Tonight I'm going to give you a lesson in astronomy. At the dead of night, 2 noble planets, Tarva and Alambile, will pass within 1 degree of each other. Such a conjunction has not occurred for 200 years, and your highness will not live to see it again. Right? So this is the pretext that they have. And he even though time is like kind of important, he even pauses while he watches the 2 planets align before telling Caspian there. So it's really important to him that Tarva and Alambile are passing each other, right? Sort of saluting each other. It says, Dr. Cornelius said nothing for about 2 minutes, but stood still with his eyes fixed on Tarva and Alambile. Then he drew a deep breath and turned to Caspian. There, he said, you have seen what no man now alive has seen, nor will see again. Yeah,
you're absolutely right. And I think it's neat that later on when Caspian and the dwarves and Trufflehunter meet the centaurs and they meet Glenstorm, who's this stargazer, he mentions the conjunction was important, and it tells us that this is going to be a war. Like this is a new age coming into Narnia. It's not just like a cover Cornelius is using to try to get away and sort of have a quiet place to talk to Prince Caspian, but it actually is sort of a cosmic sign of what's coming, which is really neat.
It certainly, obviously, it speaks to Lewis's interest in the planets, which was very much important both in his scholarship and in his fiction.
Did you get any Ransom trilogy vibes from this little tidbit?
Kind of. Mainly the Ransom trilogy reminds me of other work that Lewis has done called The Discarded Image, where he talks about the medieval view of the universe and the sort of parts that the planets play. Like I see what he kind of articulates in The Discarded Image very much in the Space Trilogy, and I also see it very much here as well, that this is a medieval world, medieval-ish world, and he can't envision a medieval world without astrology. That's just so important to the medieval mind.
I love that image he uses in the Space Trilogy of this isn't just deep space. That's not a right word for it. This is high heavens. Like it's alive, it's moving. There are dances of stars and constellations, and astronomy is part of creation, and it's actively showing us something. And I think you see that in this moment in Prince Caspian. Very subtle tie down to the Space Trilogy.
He tries to recover the medieval vision of planets as intelligences, as almost sort of beings, right? That's certainly the case here. It's certainly the case with the stars in Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and it's also the case in the Space Trilogy. What should we say about the rest of Caspian's adventure that's told? Were there parts that really interested you from his sort of wandering through the woods and being discovered by Trufflehunter and the dwarves?
It's one of those classic fairy tale stories of wake up, sir, we have to get you out of here. You're not safe anymore. Go. And in the middle of the night, fleeing the castle because a new heir is born, and he's on his way, of course, that classic sort of Lost Woods sort of picture of the sky is cracking in half of lightning and thunder. He runs into a tree, and of course, It's just a wonderfully sort of charming Lewis way. The characters that he meet are a badger and two dwarfs. Those three characters are such an interesting trio. Lewis could have had him meet anybody. He could have had Caspian run into the children. He could have had him run
Right.
into Aslan himself. He could have picked anybody, but he picks these three particular characters. Why do you think that is? What do you see when you see Trufflehunter, Trumpkin, and Nikabrik?
That's a good question. Off the cuff, I see them as types that Lewis is kind of saying something about. He's using them to comment on like sort of types of attitudes that people have toward the past and toward the present. You have the dwarves who are almost sort of stand-in for most kind of, I don't know, a lot of sort of modern humans who interpret just about everything politically in terms of power and what they can get, right? The kinds of power plays they can.
I'm here for whoever can help the dwarves. I'll believe in anything, and I'll believe in whoever can help my people out the best. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Which, I mean, I will say this for Nikabrik, he cares about his people, right? He doesn't just care about himself. That's something that is redeeming about Nikabrik, even if just about nothing else is.
He's very eager to kill, which I can appreciate.
Yes, he is.
I can appreciate that too. I'll put that in the positive column.
That's right.
He's like pulls out his knife a couple times, and they have to like sit on him.
Yeah, I love that as a defense too against being knifed. Like just sit on your attacker or someone else's attacker. Trumpkin, who by the way ends up being the dwarf that is telling the story, right? Trumpkin seems to be a type of person who is very skeptical about things. He's kind of the St. Thomas of the bunch. Needs to see things with his own eyes in order to believe in them. So it's an honest, scientific, skeptical position towards things, or at least materialist skeptical position. A little bit like the Great Knock, right? Who is Lewis's tutor, and then Trufflehunter is someone who has a much simpler faith, right? Who, because Trufflehunter dwells on these old promises and these old stories, he has a kind of wisdom that allows him to be more discerning, actually, than Trumpkin or Nikabrik are. I don't know. I guess I see them just as, if you want to go Brothers K on it, I'd say Trufflehunter is a combination of Dmitri and Alyosha. Nikabrik is Smerdyakov, and Trumpkin is Ivan as far as like types. They're interesting, and I don't know how they all came to be living in the same den.
What kind of want ad did they find on Narnian Craigslist where a badger who's really sort of conservative minded and believes the old stories shacks up with a red dwarf and a black dwarf, and they get along pretty well, but they're also constantly nagging at each other. So I guess they are pretty typical roommates in that sense.
Yeah, Nikabrik's probably always drinking.
Nikabrik, it's your turn to do the dishes, Nikabrik. Oh man.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and then he tries to knife you, talks about how the dwarves are always, being put upon, and plays the victim card. Yeah, and it's interesting too, like when they go and gather support for their army, Trumpkin, there are a bunch of other dwarves like Trumpkin living together, and there are a bunch of other dwarves like Nikabrik living together. So yeah, it's just odd that they would end up living together and also having a badger live with them.
Who knows? Exactly. There might be some medieval reference that we're just not getting here, some great classic literary reference that C.S. Lewis is trying to point us to, but it's probably just got lost to time, and who knows now. The great epic story of two dwarves and a badger, and
that's right.
When you understand that, the whole thing clicks together.
That's right.
Until then, we're left to wonder.
Dwarves and badgers both kind of dig, right? So there's there's a digging where they're trying to get down to old Narnia.
Ooh, there you go.
If you want to get super allegorical.
There you go. I like it. I think the clearest image you can make out of the dwarves and the badger are they're definitely three characters on a spectrum of belief. You have Trufflehunter, who's like, yep, I'm on board. I'm going to believe Aslan no matter what. We beast don't forget. We beast are, that sort of sense of like, oh, we remember. I remember. Yes. Nothing's going to shake me. Nothing's going to shake my faith in Aslan. And then a little bit over the spectrum, you have Trumpkin in sort of the middle, where he's like, over time, he learns to believe and he learns to sort of follow Aslan's path, but he doesn't easily believe. He sort of has to see it before he believes it. And then, of course, beyond that, you have Nikabrik. He doesn't care what he believes. He's just going to do what he believes, and he's just going to hold on to his own personal convictions regardless of what happened. Yeah, I think they probably all signed up on the same Facebook Marketplace housing ad, and they just sort of showed up on the first day like a bunch of freshman students and just sort of stuck together. Finding new roommates is hard. So once you get in with a pretty decent pair of dwarves, you just sort of stick with them, I guess.
Yeah, Trufflehunter is nothing if not patient and stubborn. He's probably the one sort of making peace between the two dwarves more often than not.
Always threatening to like, you better calm down or I'm going to sit on your head.
That's
exactly.
right. That's right. It's the one thing you have that you can use against a dwarf if you're a badger. Anything else you want to say about the chapters about Caspian gathering this army together, finding all these people who live in hiding, or bad luck that they have fighting against Miraz's army?
Yeah, totally. I think through all of these early chapters, both with the children on the island and continuous into this part where Caspian's sort of gathering his community together, gathering his army together, there's so many examples of gracious leading, for lack of a better word. There's such a great picture of graciously leaning in and supporting one another as they sort of problem solve. It's like, okay, we're on the island. What do we do next? And there's so much debate and so much sort of like, well, let's catch gulls' eggs. No, let's not do that. Let's try to catch crabs. Oh, wait, we don't have anything to catch crabs. Let's try this. Let's try. There's open discussion about problem solving. And throughout that whole process, they're constantly looking out for each other, and they're constantly being gracious and kind to one another. You see that picture continue with Caspian as he sort of gathers his followers. I love there's these little really sweet character moments where he meets the Bulgy Bears, and they take a long, and C.S. Lewis sort of abbreviates it. He's like, they take a long time to explain the story again, because again, this is like the fourth time we've had this tell this story over and over again. But they say they tell it finally to where the bears understand them, and the bears offer Caspian honey. Something like, Caspian thought it would be polite to accept, but it took him a long time to get unsticky. Like, that's sort of like, there's these little sweet moments of Caspian is gathering these sort of followers and these sort of community around him. There's little moments of him showing honor, like when the squirrel runs to grab him a nut. Trufflehunter reminds him of like, all right, it's polite not to look and see where squirrels hide their nuts. It's just like every little interaction is sort of like filled with or painted with these moments of politeness and honor, almost like Caspian's gathering his troops and gathering his sort of followers, but it's very gracious, and it's a beautiful picture by Lewis.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, and I like it's paralleled by the fact that the four children are all kind of getting along pretty well too.
Well, even when they don't, like, I think there's a couple of moments where like tempers were close to flaring.
Yeah, true,
and
true.
They start getting hot and they get thirsty, and I remember being sort of surprised at how many adversities Lewis throws at the children right out the gate. Like, he strands them on a desert island, and they don't have any food, no water, and they're arguing about like, am I hungry? Am I thirsty? All right, we got to get some firewood. They find apples, but then they immediately get tired of apples. Like this, it's almost like a survival story outright. And I think
it's so weird.
Yeah, Lewis uses that in a really cool way. He shows them problem solving and getting frustrated with each other and stumbling, sort of clumsy way. They still work it out, and they still sort of figure out the puzzle.
Yeah, I mean, you'd think there'd be more of an emotional payoff when Miraz finally bites it, if from the beginning the children are facing Miraz rather than facing
that's interesting.
A desert island, right? like it's such a windy, twisty way to do it, and I think it probably robs him something in terms of an emotional payoff when Miraz finally is killed. But of course, I don't think Lewis is terribly interested in pulling like a Mel Gibson movie villain thing with Miraz, right? Where you just like hate the bad guy so much, like Miraz is just sort of he's kind of a pitiful villain. He's kind of pathetic.
And I think
more so than the White Witch.
Well, I think you're totally right, and I think it reminds me of the Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe in the sense of when they kill the witch, it's not even Peter who kills her. It's of course it's Aslan who comes in and saves the day. In the same way, Peter doesn't defeat Miraz. Miraz sort of gets eaten by his own men in sort of a sabotage, sort of treacherous way. Which I know Lewis loves writing villains that sort of collapse under their their own evilness. There's many examples of that in Lewis's writings, but yeah, I think Miraz is that great picture of villains almost don't need the hero to destroy them because they end up destroying themselves more often than not. Get back to your point, it would probably feel much different if the children seemed to appear in Narnia right at the castle or right in Miraz's court, and the whole book they're struggling against Miraz. In a weird way, they spend 3/4 of the book, they hardly even know who Miraz is.
They're just kind of wandering around.
It's almost not man versus man in this book. The antagonist is sort of like the environment. It's one of those great environment versus character books instead of
that's the weird thing about it. It's man versus nature for sure.
Man
and
versus
you'd think it would be that way in the book where it was always winter but never Christmas, right? Like you think they'd be like, it was so cold and our feet were freezing and blah blah blah, because like that's a big part of what the witch does. I mean, a little bit with Edmund when he's helping to pull that sledge.
And in a certain sense, Miraz is totally the antagonist, obviously, and the Telmarines are the antagonists. But in a bigger picture, if you try to take it all from the Heaven Seas perspective, it's totally sort of a survival. How are these 4 teenagers going to figure out how to survive in this wilderness?
One thing that's also interesting to me that Lewis really highlights and I think does a good job of is kind of using Nikabrik as a foil for the rest of the rebellion, which is for a guerrilla warfare movement in the mountains. It's pretty moderate. They're not just kind of embracing any path to victory. Nikabrik's like, oh yeah, there's some ogres and hags I could introduce you to, and Caspian says certainly not, and Trufflehunter says I should think not indeed. We want none of that sort on our side, right? So
Nikabrik is a total ends justifies the means type, which has its benefits here and there, but like he carries that so strongly, he holds onto that so dearly that it costs him in the end, obviously, as we'll learn later. But yeah, you're absolutely right.
The other thing that I thought that I think is always really interesting about this book and Narnia in general is this idea that humans are kind of like the rulers of Narnia. That as Trufflehunter says, things were never right unless there was a human ruling Narnia, which is interesting because they are, and this is kind of a piece with the like character of the revolution as being like kind of very moderate. They're fighting for not some upstart that they're going to put on the throne, but they're fighting for the kingship of the person who is actually the correct king of the Telmarines, right?
Yeah, it's not just a full revolution, it's a restoration of a former kingdom.
Absolutely.
That changes the whole character of the whole uprising.
Yeah, and it's the people that they're trying to overthrow are humans. They're a big old group of humans that are there and kind of ruling unnaturally, but at the same time they're trying to overthrow them with other people from their same group, right? So all they're really asking is to be able to live life and be out in the open talking beasts and other sort of magical creatures while being ruled by a human who could arrogate a bunch of power to himself again and kick out all the magical beasts again. But they just seem, the faithful old creatures of Narnia seem just stuck on this idea that the correct person to rule Narnia is a son of Adam or a daughter of Eve, which is odd.
Yeah, it is such an interesting train of thought. And it makes me think of that quote near the end of the book where Aslan is talking to Prince Caspian and he's like, do you feel like you're up to the kingship? And Prince Caspian was like, I don't, honestly. He's like, well, that's good. That means you're on the right track. And then he goes into that great quote where Caspian says, well, I wish I had higher lineage. And Aslan's like, you are a son of Adam and Lady Eve. That's enough honor to raise the head of every beggar and enough shame to humble the head of the emperor or something like that. Of the highest emperor. It's this complex Christian idea of mankind of, there is so much value in it and we rule and have dominion over creation. But at the same time, it's a complex complex relationship we have, because we have all the honor of being children and creations of God and having his sort of thumbprint on us, but we also have that sinful nature of it's a mix of honor and shame, being glorified but not fully glorified.
Yep. No,
That's what made me think of that.
I think that's a great point. Yeah, here's the quote. "You, Sir Caspian," said Aslan, "might have known that you could be no true king of Narnia unless, like the kings of old, you were a son of Adam and came from the world of Adam's sons, and so you are."
That story being of where the Telmarines came from. I love that they come from the South Pacific, because as I read through the book, I mentally imagine them as like your typical North Europeans, medieval knights and stuff. But really, after learning that they're all from the South Pacific, I automatically have to reimagine them all as like Maui from Moana or something.
Right.
They're all giants and Moans or
Yeah,
something.
but yeah, they are pirates who landed on an island in the South Seas, just kind of pillaged, forcibly took wives, right? So they are probably part South Pacific Islander and part, if the pirates were European pirates, part European, but possibly some other kind of pirate, right?
We'll just say they were French. It's easy to pick on.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, these French Telmarines. That, by the way, is something that I had trouble not thinking about the whole time I was reading this because of the Norman conquest. Because the reason English is as jacked up as it is that around the year 1066, England was conquered by a bunch of French-speaking Normans. They got rid of the aristocracy, put their own aristocracy in place, and so for a very long time we had French-speaking rulers for several hundred years, which is why we got so much French in our language. But the resolution to that was not we kicked all the French out, all French-speaking people out. It's that they had causes for war with the French people who were still living in France, right? So they suddenly got very nationalistic and started speaking English at court instead of French. And so you still had the same, this is where the name like William and Henry and all these names that we think of as English names, they all come from French names, which is sort of parallel to this, right? I mean, Caspian... Yeah. All the Telmarines don't get kicked out. Caspian actually continues to rule. And presumably, like any humans that you have in Narnia after this point are Telmarine, right? I don't think any...
That's a good point. Yeah.
Anyone else who's human would have been there. It's just this kind of like rebalancing that happens, which is exactly what the rebellion kind of wants to happen, right? Not that we get rid of all the humans, but we sort of change things around a little bit, so there's sort of a new, so the human ruler realizes that his country is
something's gone wrong in our Telmarine history, and we have to sort of reform or sort of rejigger everything to the right way of Aslan. So I think it's so fascinating. Yeah. You can easily imagine a sequel to Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe where, the children are back in Narnia and they gather up with a bunch of fawns and they gather up with a bunch of centaurs and they're gathering up with a bunch of woodland creatures, and they're going to take down not the White Witch, but someone just like the White Witch. Like you can sort of see that as like a very basic sequel to Narnia, but this is so different and it's so much more complex that it leaves you sort of like spinning in all your imagination. That represents this or that. It's just it goes to show what depths C.S. Lewis pulled from.
That's about all we have time for this episode. Logan, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you'll be back. And in fact, I think you will.
I'll be happy to be back. And as I edit this episode, we'll see where it turns out. This might be the quickest hour of the Inklings Variety Hour ever.
We'll see. Well, thanks so much.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
All right. Thank you, listeners. And next time, we'll really get into what happens when the four children not enter a wardrobe so much, but enter the very frame of the story they've been listening to and influence events in Narnia that they've been hearing about. So stay tuned for that.
All blessed encounter, full of joy, unscheduled on a decent plan, with here an addict of Tolkien, there a Charles Williams fan.